This episode is brought to you by Jira. Jira is the only project management tool you need to plan and track work across any team. So if you're a team of developers, Jira better connects you with teams like marketing and design, so you have all the information you need in one place. Plus, their AI helps you knock out the small stuff so you can focus on delivering your best work. Get started on your next big idea today in Jira.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
It feels like you can get your credit scores anywhere these days. Random websites, card statements, budgeting apps, heck, even your dog might bark out a few numbers. It's true. Credit Karma isn't the only place you can find them. But we actually do more with your scores to help you find your next financial opportunity. Like a more rewarding credit card, a game plan that helps you pay down debt faster, or a personal loan to help you save more on interest payments each month. Cha-ching! The possibilities are kinda endless. Download Intuit Credit Karma today to get started.
Many civilizations throughout time have some sort of legend of what could be at the center of the Earth. Surprisingly, most of those tell of a world within our planet that houses some sort of civilization or important stage of life, such as it being where departed souls will go after their time on the surface is over. More modernly, there has been a plethora of reports from some surprising sources of explorations to the furthest northern and southern points of Earth, where said explorers were surprised to not find a singular point that marks the zenith of our planet, but rather found an enormous open cavity that leads into a world that we are never told about in school. Stories of giant humans, flying saucers, ancient flora and fauna, as well as a subtropical environment are just some of the incredible reports that have been told by admirals, psychologists, and geologists, amongst many others, when describing their own encounters with this jaw-dropping new world. Today we dive into the stories of those that dared explore the world which should not exist in Hollow Earth Part 3, Exploration. And welcome back to Infinite Rabbit Hole. Welcome back to the Infinite Rabbit Hole podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy, and today we're on week 3 of our coverage of the Hollow Earth. I'm not going to talk too much here, everybody, but please, before we continue, give us that 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform that you're listening to us on, and leave us a nice review. If you can't, go on over to infiniterabbithole.com and click on the Rate Us tab at the top, and let us know how you feel. 5 stars means the world to us. We're a small podcast, and little things like that go a long way. Anyways, without further ado, here is Hollow Earth, Part 3, Exploration. See you on the other side. The Byrd Expeditions. Quote, "I'd like to see that land beyond the pole. That area beyond the pole is the center of the great unknown," said by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. When someone speaks of Hollow Earth, one of the very first names that comes to mind is that of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Everyone seems to be very well aware that he had supposedly flown over the South Pole in Antarctica and discovered a massive hole leading to a completely subterranean world that was previously unknown to mankind. But the truth is that Byrd actually flew over both the South and North Poles during 2 separate expeditions. The 1,700-mile flight he took into the area within the North Pole resulted in similar descriptions to his 2,300-mile expedition to a similar area at the South. In an interview following his first expedition, Byrd was quoted as calling this mission, quote, "the most important expedition in the history of the world." What he described on his northern flight was not that of more ice and frigid temperatures, but rather land consisting of forests, mountains, lakes, rivers, lush vegetation, and even strange animals previously undocumented, which resembled that of the extinct woolly mammoth. This new land was accessed by way of an enormous cavity that Byrd had entered, which revealed a whole world not of the convexity like that of the crust of the Earth, but rather a concave landscape following the inner curves of the planet we call home. The expeditions took place in 1947 and 1956 and encompassed travel equaling 4,000 miles of pure aerial discovery of an existence never seen on any map ever created by man. The January 13, 1956 expedition led by Byrd highlighted a trek into the unknown area in the Antarctic, which was announced as successful by way of radio communication by a Rear Admiral George Dufek of the United States Navy Air Unit. Quote, "Once again, we have penetrated an unknown and mysterious land which does not appear on today's maps. The base in which the flight took off from was at McMurdo Sound, just 400 miles from the proposed South Pole. Byrd unfortunately passed away at his home in New York the following year, so the continued prodding into his mind about his apparent discoveries never really took place. So why did the government never come forward with the discoveries made by Byrd and his team? Well, there are plenty of reasons to speculate when it comes to this. One of the most commonly accepted answers is that the US government saw this as an opportunity to have access to additional land to claim for the US. This would lead to an abundance of natural resources, some possibly even new, and if word would get out about the discovery made, it would lead to other countries pushing forward into their own encroachment of this new world. There was no telling how large these areas actually were because Byrd's team never reached the other side of either cavity and had to turn back due to fuel reserves. The initial description of the enormous state of these new lands were compared to that of the US in size. The US being roughly 2,800 miles wide at its greatest width would have been the best comparison that they would have had at the time. But even on the Antarctic trip, which saw a total of 2,300 miles over the cavity, the expedition never saw the other side to confirm the exact scale of their discovery. For comparison, the distance from Utqiagvik, Alaska, the most northern town in the state, to Hammerfest, Norway, the most northern town in that country, is 2,600 miles, an area that is smaller than the width of the United States. And that represents a straight line that would pass directly through the Arctic, not including the position that they would have taken off from, which would have been a ship or a base on the coast of the Arctic region. The reason that this is significant is that he had reached the area that was supposed to be the North Pole after only 200 miles into the flight. The rest of the 1,500 miles were over not more ice, not more sea, but rather Byrd and his crew described seeing forests and everything that comes with them hundreds of miles beyond the timberline. Side note, the timberline is the area of the planet that trees stop growing due to harsh frigid climates. This can also be seen on a smaller scale on mountains with snowcaps. Another huge question that is asked when it comes to Admiral Byrd's claims is, of course, whether or not we can accept it as truth. Well, there are a few things to note. One, there were a handful of press releases that were distributed during the time of his discovery that documented interviews with Byrd himself. 2. The first expedition, which took place in 1947 in the Antarctic, is famously known as Operation High Jump, led by Byrd, by the way, and was officially described as the US's establishment of the Little America 4 military base, which for some reason needed 4,700 men, 13 naval ships, and 33 aircraft. 3. High Jump was followed by Operation Deep Freeze in 1956. Also led by Byrd, which was the title used for the excuse to have a constant US military presence in the Antarctic regions at all times. So I personally want to know why, if Rear Admiral Byrd was very vocal about his discovery in the Arctic in 1947, was he allowed to stay in service and also be given the important role of leader and coordinator of a mirrored expedition in the same year to Antarctica, not once, but twice, 9 years apart? Then why did he suddenly die the year after the Deep Freeze operation? And why was Antarctica such a hot zone for research by almost every first world nation on Earth, immediately after which eventually led to the famed Antarctic Treaty signed in 1959, which eliminated the use of military operations within the region under the guise of quote-unquote scientific research. All this is Googleable, by the way. You do not need to look far for this very public information. Admiral Byrd's diary. Admiral Richard E. Byrd was appointed as a midshipman in the United States Navy and graduated from the Naval Academy in July of 1912. Admiral Byrd did many great things while he was in the Navy, and he would have had in order to earn the rank of Rear Admiral. But the first thing we should mention in regard to this subject is the expedition he and Chief Aviation Pilot Floyd Bennett embarked on in order to attempt to fly over the North Pole in 1926. This incredible feat would eventually have both Byrd and Bennett awarded the Tiffany Cross Medal of Honor by President Calvin Coolidge. This flight would later fall into scrutiny as it was found in 1996 that a diary was discovered of Byrd's that didn't directly say that the flight was unsuccessful, but certainly implied it. This also could not have been true if the 3 flights between 1947 and 1956 really yielded the discovery of the hollow Earth. Now, before we actually embark on this incredible journey, I feel the need to insert some tidbits about a few things. First off, I would like to talk about a second diary that was discovered of Admiral Byrd's. This diary has been created into a book for public consumption and can be bought now in any online bookstore. I got my copy off Amazon. The title of the book is The Missing Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd, A Secret Expedition, and a Journey to a Paradise Inside the Earth. The authors are listed as Admiral Byrd himself and a Timothy G. Beckley. Now, I don't know too much about Mr. Beckley, but I can say that for $20, this book is an incredible disappointment, as the book is about the size of a regular spiral notebook and has all about 20 words on every other page, but the pages in between the worded pages have incredible photographs, diagrams, and illustrations. And honestly, if you want a book with pictures from Byrd's trips and career, this would be a great price for these amazing pictures. I personally do not put a lot of weight in this book, but after listening to a few other shows' adaptations of the Admiral Byrd story, it is clear that many do take this extremely seriously and report on it as so. So that is what we're about to do right now. Again, I wanted to put this out as a sort of disclaimer to make all those aware that this specific source does not seem credible to me. But I do want to also say that this in no way, shape, or form sways me away from the belief that Admiral Byrd did see something extraordinary on these flights. But without further ado, here is the Admiral Byrd story of his discovery of the world inside of the Earth as told by his quote-unquote missing diary, which reads as if it were a flight log. The expedition began at 0610 on the morning of February 19, 1947, from what he only refers to as, quote, Base Camp Arctic. At 0910, Admiral Byrd radios into base that he is seeing an array of different colors speckled in the snowy landscape. He describes generally linear patterns of colors yellow, red, and purple from his position of about 2,000 feet in the air. During the same radio transmission, he also describes what seems to be a malfunction with both the gyro and magnetic compasses, and he continues his flight by heading only. 5 minutes later, he claims to spot what looks like mountains in the distance. At 1000 hours, Admiral Byrd again radios into base camp that he is now on the other end of the mountains, and below he can see a valley with a stream or a small river running through it. He seems unnerved due to not understanding the situation. Quote, there should be no green valley below. Something is definitely wrong. His navigation instruments are still spinning out of control, and just a few minutes later he calls back in to report that he had dropped an elevation of 1,000 feet to get a better view of what he is referring to as a woolly mammoth. At 10:30, the Admiral claims that the radios are not functioning and he can no longer contact base camp. The outside ambient temperature reads 74 degrees Fahrenheit, and he is surrounded by rolling green hills when what he really should be seeing is nothing but a frozen infinity. At 11:30, things start to get even stranger as he begins his log describing what he claims to be a city and strange disc-shaped flying craft closing in on him. As the saucers get closer, the Admiral claims to see swastikas marked on the side of the craft and claims to no longer be able to control his plane. A few minutes later, a voice comes over his radio with a German or Nordic accent saying, quote, welcome, Admiral, to our domain. We shall land you in exactly 7 minutes. Relax, Admiral. You are in good hands. The The engines shut down and the plane continues its flight, controlled by some unseen force as he begins to slowly descend as his landing gear makes a soft landing. The Admiral describes men approaching the aircraft who are tall and have blonde hair without any signs of weapons. A voice calls out from outside for the Admiral to open the cargo door. Admiral Byrd complies as he does not see an option. This is where the first log ends, and he began describing everything at a later time from memory alone. Admiral Byrd and his radio man are taken very calmly and politely as they and the party step onto a smooth conveyor belt, and they are transported without any effort into the city at the base of the airfield. Byrd describes the city as seeming like it was made of crystal, as it is very shiny and extravagant. The conveyor brought them right to the front of a building that he doesn't seem to have words for to describe. And while they are in this building, they are given a warm beverage that is like nothing he has ever tasted, and he claimed it was delicious. Soon after, Byrd and his radio man are approached by a small group of men as they ask the Admiral to follow them alone. At this point, he splits with the radio man and enters what he believes is an elevator. After heading downwards for a short while, he is ushered into a room where he is, quote, to have an audience with the master. As he is admiring an absolutely beautiful setting in this room, he is welcomed by a warm and rich voice, which is coming from what Byrd describes as an older being that beckons him to have a seat at his table. Quote, "We have let you enter here because you are of noble character and well known on the surface world, Admiral. You are in the domain of the Ariani, the inner world of the Earth. We shall not long delay your mission, and you will be safely escorted back to the surface and for a distance beyond. But now, Admiral, I shall tell you why you have been summoned here." The older being describes to Byrd that it was when the surface world had set off atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that the underworld responded by sending up the craft they call Flugerads to investigate what had happened. He continues to explain that the civilizations in the underworld have been in contact with leaders of the outer world and they do not heed their warnings about atomic weapons. He explains that the science of his people is thousands of years more advanced than anything the man has on the surface. The older being continues to explain that they have attempted to contact many different lower-level people on the surface in order to attempt to get their words across to the people under the control of the leaders, but their Flugerads are always being fired on. He claims that this is their final attempt to try and save humanity, and that Byrd is the one that needs to spread the word of the underworld and their wishes of peace on the surface. The older being claims that this is the beginning of the end for mankind, and he wishes to not see it end. From this point, the Admiral was ushered back up to the level where his radio man was, who we now find out whose name is Howie, and the two men from the surface stepped back onto the conveyor and was sent back to their plane. The men jumped in and were quickly lifted into the air up to about 2,500 feet and began their travel back to base camp under an unseen force. Admiral Byrd notes that the airspeed indicator is not reading any of the plane's forward momentum. After a few hours, a voice came over the radio and announced that their flight controls had been freed. The voice sounded off Wiedersehen, goodbye, in German, and Admiral Byrd and his radio men watched as the two Flugerads departed the flight group, and the two men were back to just the two of them. There is not a lot about what happened between this part of the trip and when they landed. In fact, the next meaningful thing added to the diary is when he mentions that on March 11, 1947, he had briefed staff at the Pentagon about the trip and all of the experiences that he and Howie, the radio man, had witnessed and endured. Admiral Byrd claims to have been detained at this time and sent through multiple mental and physical health screenings before being allowed back to the fleet. And at this point of the diary, Byrd claims that he is given instructions to not speak of his discovery and is reminded that he is an active duty service member and that he must obey orders. Now, all of this information that involves Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd and his incredible journey to the inner Earth lies in the belief that the diary actually exists or existed at some point. The author of a specific article in the 1959 special Hollow Earth edition of the Flying Saucers magazine by the name of Ray Palmer may have more to do with the story of Admiral Byrd's amazing expedition than the Admiral did himself. In the article, he quoted Byrd in a speech that he supposedly gave where he introduced the concept of his journey into the inner Earth to the world. But unfortunately, the readers of the magazine were keen to this and wrote to the editor for a solid source in these statements, which eventually forced Palmer to admit in a later edition of his publication that he may have taken the word of someone without checking his sources. This mystery person would eventually be revealed as F. Amadeo Giannini, the author of the book titled Worlds Beyond the Poles, which was released earlier in the same year, which discussed Byrd's southern expeditions in a sort of a fantastical way, in which he described Byrd as not going to the inner Earth, but rather a land above the Earth. It is the belief of many that this is the actual origin of the famed Admiral Byrd diary. But to defend the other side of the story, Byrd did somehow spend time in a mental institute after Operation High Jump. This is documented and can be fact-checked. But why? Well, he did say some pretty weird things in interviews, such as being quoted as saying something about the quote-unquote land beyond the pole on a few different occasions. It is my belief that Byrd did know something, and that something may have been more than the U.S. military was willing to let the public know about. Was it an entrance to the Hollow Earth? Was it the true origin of the popular flying saucer phenomenon? Maybe the civilization of Atlantis trapped under the Antarctic ice? It's hard to say, but there are for sure some questions about the entire story that remain unanswered. The followers. But where Rear Admiral Byrd left off, others would continue down many different paths and possibilities, which resulted from the implications of the now referred to Hollow Earth theory. One such other was a man by the name of Ray Palmer, who was the publisher and editor of the famed Flying Saucers magazine, which held the reign of the UFO information world from 1957 to 1976. Palmer built on Byrd's claims and used them to describe a possible origin of the flying saucer phenomenon. Quote, "How well known is the Earth? Is there any area of the Earth that can be regarded as a possible origin of the flying saucer? There are two. The two major areas of importance are the Antarctic and the Arctic." Palmer was a firm believer that UFOs did not come from extraterrestrial civilizations from some far-off place in space, but rather that they came from somewhere within the borders of our own planet. It is his belief that UFOs emerge out of their civilization's landmass by way of polar holes in the Earth that gradually ascend at a rate barely noticeable to the human eye. For the better part of the explanation, this would be seen as more of a continuation of the Earth instead of a giant hole in the ground. The edges of these cavernous lands are not sharp and rigid, but rather smooth and continuous, with a gradual change in climate proportional to that on the Earth's surface. This would be the true origin of the world's UFO phenomenon and the home of their pilots. Bunger's Oasis. During 1947's Operation High Jump, Lieutenant Commander David Bunger, who was piloting one of the Navy's largest transport planes only 4 miles inland from the area of the Shackleton ice shelf, when he and his crew discovered a chunk of land that was completely ice-free. The Oasis, which is what he was calling it, had numerous lakes that ranged in size of up to 3 miles long. The oasis was in the shape of a rough square and had sheer ice walls on 2 sides and gradual snowdrifts on the other 2, all of which seemed to lead into a landscape of infinite and desolate ice and snow. The area, now known as Bunger Hills, leads to proof that there is in fact warmth in an area of the world where there shouldn't be. The area which the oasis encompasses surpasses an area that would be affected by volcanic activity or mysterious warm winds from faraway tropical regions of the planet. No, the better explanation is that the porous composition of the crust in this area would be thinner here than in almost anywhere in the Earth due to the proximity to the proposed South Pole and the warmth of the inner planet finding its way to the surface. Explorers. On August 3, 1894, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Dr. Fridtjof Nansen of Norway, noted a description of warm weather and an abundance of life in his journal during an expedition to areas up to and beyond the North Pole. Could he have made it past the great massive freshwater ice pack described earlier? Well, also in his journal there were many entries about his compass failing and acting erratically. Another explorer by the name of Hayes kept a diary of his 1881 exploration of the Arctic region as well, and made one more interesting discovery while at latitude 78 and 17 minutes. Quote, "I secured a yellow-winged butterfly, and, who would believe it, a mosquito, and also 10 moths, 3 spiders, 2 bees, and 2 flies. At this latitude, it would be almost impossible to think that the insects gathered by Hayes came from a place south of his location. Hayes' findings were published in a book titled 3 Years of Arctic Service by Adolphus W. Greeley in 1886. This was a truly good find, as this book made zero claim to anything close to regarding a hollow earth, and yet we see evidence of the mysteries people were seeing. And from 1822 to 1824, British explorer James Weddell thoroughly recorded encountering ice-free areas of a sea in the Antarctic that would eventually bear his name. The trip took him as far south as 74 degrees and 15 minutes, which broke Captain James Cook's 1774 record while captaining the famed British mercantile ship, the HMS Resolution.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
Starbucks Iced Apple Crisp Oat Milk Shaken Espresso. Made with blonde espresso, creamy oat milk, and spiced apple flavors. It's an icy crisp sip you can enjoy all autumn long. Order ahead on the Starbucks app.
Now, I know this one was a short one, but honestly, if I doubled down on some of the previously mentioned topics, mostly in part 1, this would have been half a repeat episode, and I just didn't want to do that for you. Now, there are some explorers mentioned in part 1, specifically notated in a specific book, so I made this part mostly about Admiral Byrd. And honestly, Admiral Byrd could have been talked about quite a bit longer, and I felt it important to talk about him as this is probably the go-to piece of information when anybody wants to talk about Hollow Earth. But unfortunately, I don't think that there's a lot of weight here. There's a lot of weight when it comes to other aspects of the Hollow Earth and some of the evidence that has been laid forward. But unfortunately, I don't believe that's with Admiral Byrd. Now, do you agree or disagree with me? Let me know. Head on over to Facebook, Instagram, X, anywhere that you do your social mediaing. We should be there, and send me a message or send me an email at infiniterabbithole@gmail.com and let me know what you think. Well, next week we go ahead and wrap up our month-long journey into the topic of the Hollow Earth, and we celebrate 4 years of the Infinite Rabbit Hole. Until next time, travelers, I'll see you in the next fork in the path of the Infinite Rabbit Hole. Goodbye. I would like to thank you once again for tuning into the Infinite Rabbit Hole podcast. Please make sure to give us a follow and one of those beautiful 5-star ratings on your podcast player of choice. If you would like to join the conversation and stay up to date on all things Infinite Rabbit Hole, head on over to Facebook and search for the Infinite Rabbit Hole Facebook group. You'll know it's us when you see the logo. If you would like to help contribute to the cause, there are a few ways to do so. First, head on over to anchor.fm/Infinite Rabbit Hole and click on the subscribe button, where for $5 a month you'll get access to all our old episodes that will never see the free spotlight ever again. It's horrible stuff, but if you're into that kind of thing, then go check it out. Second, head on over to infiniterabbithole.com and click on the IRH merch shop tab and grab yourself a sweet t-shirt, sticker, or whatever else you see that you wouldn't mind owning. Until next time, travelers, I'm Jeremy, and I'll see you at the next fork in the path of the Infinite Rabbit Hole. Bye.